Dear Professor Pettegree, floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I want to thank you all for this delightful invitation to come to Riga to speak to you. This is my first visit to Riga, and it's been fantastic to be able to travel around and look at the city in such a beautiful summer's period. I also want to congratulate you on this wonderful new National Library. I have to say that the libraries that I'm going to talk about today all come to a pretty terrible fate. They are either burnt down or they lose all their books. So I can only wish that this is not a bad omen for your new project. Gian Vincenzo Pinelli of Padua in northern Italy was one of the great book collectors of the 16th century. As he approached the end of his life in 1601, he made plans for his magnificent library to become a permanent monument to his taste and erudition. The 10,000 volumes he'd accumulated were to be transported to the family home near Naples, where a library was to be constructed on the family estate for the public to share. Now, such aspirations were not unusual in the 16th century scholarly world, but the actual fate of his collection provides a cautionary tale of the dangers facing any scholar trying to build a legacy. First of all, the Venetian government intervened to remove certain manuscripts they regarded as politically sensitive. A servant stole some of the books. The collection was eventually loaded onto 3 ships for transportation through the Adriatic, but one was intercepted by pirates. When they discovered the cases on board contained nothing but books, they threw several overboard. The abandoned ship was washed ashore and plundered by local fishermen. Of the 33 cases of books left on board, the authorities could recover only 22. The valuable volumes taken by the locals were dismembered and used to mend boats or to provide primitive window coverings. The stiff parchment pages of the most valuable manuscripts, which included a phenomenal collection of Greek text, proved to be excellent draft excluders for windows. Now, barely had the remains of the collection made its way to Naples when Pinelli's nephew died, so the idea of a permanent library in Naples died with him. After prolonged legal activity, the collection was purchased at auction by Cardinal Borromeo for his new library in Milan, the Bibliotēka Ambrosiana. Borromeo's agents now made a careful selection for the long journey back to Italy, discarding those damaged by water and rodents and books of minimal interest to their new owner. The following year, what remained of the manuscripts and a selection of the printed text finally reached their new home. Now, the unfortunate history of Pinelli's library is more colourful than most. The majority of books published during the Renaissance fell victim to much more mundane dangers: rats and mice, birds and moths, damp or worms. Fire, neglect, and use all took their toll. But it does illustrate vividly the great gulf between the rhetoric of the humanist book world and the practical experience of those who sought to build a library. It might have been thought that the invention of printing in the 15th century and the huge increase in the availability of books would usher in a great new age of library building. In fact, the opposite was the case. Many of the great Renaissance collections were broken up, the victim of predators, politics, or neglect. In the 16th century, the library, as a public and private institution, as a focus of wealth and display, took a backward step. In the following minutes, I'll try to explain why this should be, why the invention of printing, so celebrated by 15th century scholars and intellectuals, posed such a testing challenge to the Renaissance library. I'll then go on to explain how, with the technologies of the 21st century, we can do something to repair this damage done by time and by pirates to the Renaissance Library. And I'll explain the work we're doing to that end in St Andrews. Well, we should begin, as do most discussions of the Renaissance Library, with the great collections of the 15th century, the era before the invention of printing. Printing, of course, did not invent the book. Medieval Europe was full of books, all carefully crafted by hand. Some were objects of great beauty, like this, others more utilitarian, for study and use. Most owners possessed no more than a handful of books, but in the 15th century, a few privileged individuals began to draw together collections of very considerable size. Some were scholars, but most were princes, rulers of Europe's city-states and emergent monarchies, for whom a library was a symbol of both wealth and cultural aspiration. Their collection building was encouraged and assisted by exponents of the new humanist scholarship. Scholars provided both the intellectual agenda for collecting and more practical services, advice on which books to buy, how to obtain the desired texts, and the introduction to capable scribes who could make the copies. Facilitated by this harmonious partnership, the rulers of Europe began to amass libraries of considerable size. The kings of France and dukes of Burgundy both had collections of over 1,000 books by 1450. But the biggest collections were in Italy. The papal library grew to several thousand volumes. The Medicis of Florence also spent a fortune on manuscripts. None of them could match the ambition of a new collector, the King of Hungary, Matthias Corvinus. When the vagaries of politics brought this obscure nobleman to the throne in 1458, Corvinus decided to bring to Budapest the best of Italian culture. Over 4,000 manuscripts, and this is one of them, were commissioned in Florence and carted over the Alps. He was buying in bulk. Several hundred were still in production when he died in 1450. The interesting point here is that Matthias's enormous collection of manuscripts was still being assembled in the last decade of the 15th century. That is, a full 40 years after the invention of printing. Contrary to what is often supposed, the invention of printing did not destroy the manuscript trade. On the contrary, the two modes of book production coexisted happily for at least 3 generations. What scholars and collectors wanted was texts. It was the huge demand for texts that had helped fuel the search for a new means of mechanical production. Most 15th century purchasers collected manuscripts or printed items indifferently, and they often bound them together in the same volume as collections. The extent of this binding has been disguised by the interventions of 19th century librarians, who often carefully disbound these collections to send the manuscripts to one room and the printed items to another, thus destroying vital evidence of 15th and 16th century collecting. This well-meaning vandalism has considerably distorted our understanding of early reading practice. As we will see in this talk, books are never in so much danger as when they're in libraries. Now, some manuscripts were actually copied from printed books, a counterintuitive reversal of what we think of the normal chronology. Collectors' acceptance of the new printed book was assisted by the fact that the first printers consciously modeled their work on manuscripts. The type was designed to look like contemporary handwriting, and the printed page often copiously decorated. This is a page from the Gutenberg Bible, of which no 2 copies are the same because they've all been individually decorated. Sometimes it's quite difficult to tell whether these are manuscripts or print. When I was in Copenhagen, as Gustav will have seen, they exhibit their Gutenberg Bible with a 12th century handwritten Bible, and the two do look actually quite similar. In that respect, Gutenberg succeeded in what he was trying to do. The printed text completed its evolution as an independent artifact, less and less like its manuscript forebear, only rather slowly. Rather than hand the text over half-finished to an illuminator, printers devised decorative features that could be incorporated directly into the text, using woodcut blocks and initial letters. The hand-painted pseudo-manuscript of Gutenberg's day became a more utilitarian object, black and white, black on white paper. And I was reminiscing with some of your colleagues earlier about the moment in my life, one of the most important moments in my childhood, when my parents brought a colour TV into the house for the first time. And television was never the same. The idea of going backwards to black and white was impossible. And yet this is what the printers had to achieve. They had to persuade people to accept this black and white object. And as you see here, it's just not very successful. The central panels are the text, surrounded by commentary, and it doesn't work. So this was difficult, how to persuade people to accept this. Mostly, though, it was the sheer profusion of books, the sheer quantity, that doomed the Renaissance library. Before print, the creation of a library was the work of a lifetime. Each text had to be tracked down, borrowed, and copied. But within 50 years of the invention of printing, the world was full of books. Something like 9 million printed objects were in circulation before 1500, within 50 years. And although many were still precious and expensive, like that Gutenberg Bible, many of the new printed books were small and relatively cheap. After 1500, the pace of production accelerated further. Thanks to the work we've accomplished in Sentendrjūs, we're now in a position to offer for the first time a reliable estimate of this total book production. Assessed country by country, the Europe-wide production of printed books amounted by 1600 to some 345,000 items, about 345,000 separate editions, about 180 million printed items. Suddenly, books were no longer an object of wonder, but an everyday aspect of life. For Europe's ruling elites, the accumulation of a library was no longer attractive. If a middle-ranking official of the Paris Parliament, like Antoine Duprat, could by 1550 accumulate a collection of 4,000 volumes, which was the size of one of the greatest collections 100 years before, then Europe's crowned heads had to look to other forms of conspicuous consumption in order to impress foreign visitors. Spending on sculpture, tapestry, painting, palaces or warships replaced the building of a library. When Matthias Corvinus built his library next door to his throne room, we do not even know where King Henry VIII of England kept his books. And Henry was a man who prided himself on his education. As the princes turned their attention to other pursuits, the great Renaissance libraries suffered a rapid decline. Some are lost completely, like the library of Matthias Corvinus and his collecting rival Lorenzo de' Medici. Others declined through neglect. In the 14th century, the city of Venice had promised the great humanist Petrarch a pension and a free home for the promise of his library after his death. He signed the contract, but he broke his promise. But when 2 centuries later, the great collector Cardinal Bessarion left to Venice his priceless collection of Greek manuscripts, it would be 100 years before the city fulfilled his stipulation that they'd be housed and conserved for public access. This is another one of those manuscripts which shows Guillaume Fichet of Paris presenting his manuscript to Bessarion. For most of this 100 years, the books hung around the Venice council chamber, packed into crates and getting in the way. The time of the public library had not yet come. Many of the great princely collections went through similar problems. The Emperor Maximilian I was one of the greatest of princely collectors. The period of his reign coincided exactly with the transition from manuscript to print, and he provided generous patronage for artisans of both the new and the old traditional arts of the book. Among the special works of art created for Maximilian were the Toyadank, an epic family chronicle in 188 chapters. But Maximilian also made very innovative use of print. He used print for sending his ordinances round his lands. This is a good example, and it's very special to me because you can see how the royal or princely ordinance here is exactly modelled on the first printed indulgences, exactly in terms of its shape and content. This is more unusual in that it is in portrait rather than landscape shape. Now, naturally, he gathered also a magnificent library, continued fitfully by his successors. But by the mid-16th century, this had fallen into irretrievable decay. When the Dutch Calvinist Hugo Blotius visited the Imperial Hofbibliothek in Vienna in 1575, it was anything but magnificent. I'll quote his diary entry. "How neglected and desolate everything looked. There was mouldiness and rot everywhere, the debris of moths and bookworms, and a thick covering of cobwebs." This is the Imperial Library. "The windows had not been opened for months, and not a ray of sunshine had penetrated through to brighten the unfortunate books, which were slowly pining away. And when they were opened, what a cloud of noxious air streamed out." Now, Blotius rolled up his sleeves, and after 10 months' work, he discovered that the collection numbered 7,379 volumes. Now, a century before, this would have been a massive collection. Now, it was not even enough to attract the emperor's attention. The great collections of the Burgundian dukes had also passed into Habsburg hands as rulers of the Low Countries, but these fared little better. The Royal Library in Brussels had, in 1559, 666 printed books and 960 manuscripts. You can see the balance of manuscript and print here is very interesting. Yet by 1683, over 100 years later, there were actually 128 fewer items in the collection than there had been. When fire consumed the building in which the library was housed in 1731, 500 of the most precious items were saved by being hurled out of a window, but the rest were lost. Even Philip II's library in Spain, in his new-built monastery palace, the Escorial, was not immune. Philip envisaged his library as a private resource and repository of pious literature, not as a place of meeting and conversation. In consequence, the fabulous collection of manuscript and printed books that he accumulated was virtually unused for the 3 centuries after his death. Now, in this great age of print, you do not need to be one of Europe's major rulers to imagine a vast new library and the opportunity it presented to gather together the world's learning. One of the century's greatest collectors was Fernando Columbus, the son of Christopher Columbus, discoverer of the Americas. He had no appetite to follow his father overseas. Instead, he gave himself to conquering another new world, Europe's books. As an advisor to the Emperor Charles V, he accompanied the Emperor on many of his journeys to leading centers of the Europe's book trade. He was a wealthy man due to his father's enterprises, and he bought anything he could, first in person, then through agents. The books were shipped back from Lyon, Montpellier, Venice, Mainz, and London, and by his death, he'd accumulated 15,000 items. I've put in this diagram because it shows all the books he bought in Montpellier in one trip, total of 434 items and the places they were printed. Now this is interesting because Montpellier didn't have a printing press, so none of them were printed there. And it just shows how efficiently the European book market was functioning in 1520. Now when he died, he left a 44-page will entirely dedicated to the preservation of his library. Instead, it was simply depreciated. In 1577, Philip II removed the early manuscripts to the Escorial. 14 years later, the collection came under the scrutiny of the Inquisition. His carefully assembled collection of Protestant works were all removed. In the centuries that followed, the neglect was so profound that the under-librarians' children used the books as toys. The neglect was such that some volumes were drenched by leaking gutters and reduced to dust. Now, only about a third of this collection survives in Seville. But happily, it is the tiny pamphlets that no one thought were worth stealing, because he was a great pamphlet collector, and these contain many unique and otherwise unknown items. What then of institutional libraries, those of schools and universities? Here, as with the princely collections, the second century of print brought something of a crisis. In the manuscript era, men journeyed from England and Scotland to the great production centres of Italy, France, and the Low Countries to buy books. The magnificent gift of Duke Humphrey of Gloucester, more than 280 precious manuscripts, helped establish the Library of the University of Oxford. But in the 16th century, these institutional collections receded in importance. The simple reason is that collections of this size, which had been eye-catching in the manuscript age, were now commonplace. By the middle of the 16th century, a junior scholar at Oxford or Cambridge might have a sizable collection of books, perhaps as many as 100. And this was the size of a decent college collection 100 years before. When John Bateman, a fellow of Gonville and Caius College in Cambridge, died in 1559, the contents of his 4-room chambers housed 500 books. Now, this was a remarkable scholarly collection. Without going to the university or the college library, Bateman would have been able to consult a virtually complete range of standard editions of the Church Fathers. He had no fewer than 12 Latin Bibles, 2 in Greek and 6 in Hebrew. He owned numerous grammars. Now, this represented a revolution in learning. Bateman had collected assiduously more recent controversial literature and a conventional sprinkling of the classics. Furthermore, these personal collections had the advantages that, bought on the contemporary market, they often contained the most recent and up-to-date scholarship. Institutional collections, accumulated by donation, were obliged to accept books no longer relevant to the syllabus or duplicates of books they already owned. The religious and educational controversies of the Reformation era posed a further challenge to institutional libraries, which could now be characterized, rather unhelpfully, as repositories of the despised scholasticism. The conflicts between Catholic and Protestant also spilled out into the libraries, as the prevailing power insisted that shelves should be cleared of everything forbidden or heretical. So these were testing times for institutional libraries. In the middle of the 16th century, the university library closed in both Oxford and Cambridge. It actually closed down. Oxford University disposed of the books and even of its library furniture. It was only in the early 17th century that the university library in Oxford found its new role in the age of print. Encouraged by alumni such as Sir Thomas Bodley, the founder of Oxford's famous Bodleian Library, universities began to accumulate serious collections of books by donation and by volume purchasing in the international book market. Sir Thomas Bodley began his project in 1598. He hoped that if he provided the funds for the building and the equipment of the shelves, others would donate the books. But when these hopes weren't realized, he started to buy himself. He employed a professional librarian, Thomas James, but he wasn't a hands-off patron. He had strong views on how the library should be stocked, which he expressed in a series of letters to the unfortunate, long-suffering Thomas James. By the time that this man, Thomas James, published his second printed catalogue in 1620, the library had assembled a collection of around 16,000 items. And the Bodleian Library was, as Bodley had hoped, a magnet for visitors from all over Europe, though most of them actually came to see manuscripts rather than printed books. This is not surprising, since most of the printed books had been imported from continental Europe and would have been available far closer to home for these scholars. Bodley was also responsible for drafting the first version of the Bodleian Oath that new readers were required to read aloud before inscribing their names as readers, as they still are, and I had to do in 1976. Here's a portion of it. You promise, you the reader, and solemnly engage before God that whenever you shall enter the public library of the university, you will frame your mind to study in modesty and silence, and will use the books and other furniture in such a manner that they may last as long as possible. Also, that you will not steal, change, make erasures, deform, tear, cut, write notes in, interline, willfully spoil, obliterate, defile, or in any other way retrench, ill-use, wear away, or deteriorate any book or books, nor authorize any other person to do likewise. Now, in its current version, it's rather different, and readers find themselves promising not to kindle a flame in the library. I have to admit that before I took this oath, it had never occurred to me that that's something I might do. But of course, once the idea enters your head, the power of suggestion is very strong. That apart, perhaps the most interesting aspect of Bodley's morbid imagination was the new emphasis on silence. The Renaissance library was a very noisy place, a place for conversation and display, rather than for study and contemplation. It was only in the 17th century, with these new collections, that the library began its long descent into silence, emerging as that new phenomenon of the 19th and 20th century, the library as mausoleum, a silent repository of countless unread treasures. Its principal purpose, the protections of books from the ravages of human contact. Now, this is the library that's had such a powerful spur to the literary imagination, most recently in Carlos Ruiz Zafón's international bestseller, The Shadow of the Wind, most famously, of course, in Umberto Eco's evocation of the library as a vast repository of hidden treasures in the medieval blockbuster, The Name of the Rose. But such fictional creations do have their basis in fact. The descent into obscurity and irrelevance was a fate that seemed in the mid-20th century even to have enveloped the French Bibliothèque Municipale, the great network of libraries set up with the plunder of the French Revolution to build a new network of readers and informed, enlightened citizens. By the middle of the 20th century, little of this original purpose remained. A report in the 1930s characterized these libraries as cold and forbidding places with out-of-date stock and very few readers. With the inherited revolutionary inheritance, the principal purpose seemed to be to keep the older stock from ever being seen. And some of this spirit, I regret to say, lives on in some of the world's great libraries today, not here in Riga, where the staff will hand over books to readers only with the greatest reluctance. Now, this, of course, is nonsensical, because 15th and 16th century books are among the hardiest books there are. They benefit from use. They like to be stretched and handled. It's the 19th century stock which is in most imminent danger of destruction. Now, the French municipal libraries were saved by a total reorganization, re-envisaged as the Videotēka, with furniture and facilities to encourage the widest public use. And this is the very fine example in Nîmes. Some of the happiest reading experiences of my career have been in these libraries, where 16th century books are often delivered to general reading areas, with the infants toddling through to the children's library and alongside war veterans with their daily papers. One of the pensioners in these libraries kindly stopped my desk to assure me that I'd get far more enlightenment from his illustrated magazine than the 16th century text I had in front of me. I didn't share my thought that actually my book was far more likely to be around in another 400 years than his magazine. Now, this, of course, is not what Bodley had in mind for all his suspicions of the dangers of youthful enthusiasm. His drive and energy allowed the University of Oxford to build very quickly a very fine collection, almost wholly through donation and purchase. Other continental libraries of this period took the more direct route. The University of Uppsala in Sweden, founded in the 15th century, in fact had no university library at all till 1620. But from that date it grew very rapidly, stocked by books plundered by the Swedish armies during the 30 Years' War. Erfurt, Eichsfeld, Mainz, and Würzburg were all looted in 1631. The first great prize had been the Jesuit library of Braunsberg in northern Poland. The Jesuit college there was founded in 1565 by the Prince Bishop of Warmia, Stanislaus Hosius. This, of course, is a 19th century picture. Hosius was one of the great figures of the Polish Counter-Reformation, a diplomat and pugnacious polemicist whose published works achieved considerable popularity throughout Europe. The establishment of the Collegium Hosanum in Braunsberg, located perilously close to Germany's Prussia, was a deliberate effort to counter the creeping spread of the Reformation. An important part of this mission was to building of a library. The establishment of such religious foundations was in fact one of the principal spurs to the development of new collections in the 16th century. In 1626, the Swedish army of Gustavus Adolphus conquered Braunsberg as part of its campaign in the Baltic region. The army laid waste to the town, but the library of the Jesuit College was treated with some care. The entire collection was crated up and sent to Uppsala, where it was incorporated into the newly established university library. Here it is, with an inscription, Collegia Braunsbergensis, at the top. And there it's remained ever since, clearly distinguished by its original marks of ownership. Recently, perhaps as a belated act of atonement, its Swedish custodians have published a detailed scholarly catalogue. Given this history of predatory collecting, there's a certain poetic irony that the Swedish Royal Library lost 3/4 of its stock, 18,000 books and 1,000 manuscripts, in a disastrous fire in 1658. It must also be said, in the Swedes' defence, that in this vastly destructive conflict in the early 17th century, the Catholic armies had shown the way by ransacking the library of the University of Heidelberg, Germany's premier medieval university. 3,000 manuscripts and 12,000 printed books were carefully crated up, loaded onto mules, and sent over the Alps as a gift to the Vatican Library, where they remain today. Now, these turbulent events found their echo in the destructive conflicts that engaged Europe's nation-states in more recent centuries. The French Revolution brought the confiscation of around 10 million books from France's abolished religious orders. Some were torn up to make cartridges for the muskets of the revolutionary armies. Others ended up in the new municipal libraries. Napoleon rebuilt the cultural capital of France by helping himself to the treasures of Italy. In the 20th century, aerial bombing posed a new and deadly hazard to the books that had survived from the first age of print. Several million were lost and others removed as plunder. The chaos at the end of the Second World War led to the destruction or dispersal of many of Europe's great scholarly collections, painstakingly assembled over 400 years. A few years ago, we received a batch of records of 16th century books presently in the collection of the State Library of St. Petersburg. while integrating this material into our files in St Andrews, I noticed an unusual convergence between these records and the holdings of the State Library in Berlin. In fact, a whole high proportion of these books turned out not to be traceable in Berlin, but are marked in the Berlin catalogue with pained resignation as possibly lost in the war. We ran a test and identified a group of some 300 French 16th century titles that were not in fact lost at the end of the war. They'd simply been removed to the Soviet Union. And this, of course, is only a tiny fraction of those not recovered by Lynn from Russia and Poland. I should say in passing that I think the dispersal of collections between 1933 and 1945 and their partial reconstitution is one of the great unstudied subjects of book history and library science. I should also say that the destruction continues into the 21st century. We have here, on the left, the Anna Amelia Library in Weimar, largely destroyed by an electrical fault in 2004, and the Library of the Cologne Archive on the right, destroyed when tunneling for a new underground system caused the archive to collapse into itself. One of my students actually worked as a volunteer on the retrieval here, and she told me that when they found printed material, she took some of it to the leaders of restitution. She said, "Oh, don't worry with the printed material, that'll be somewhere else." So that was just left. And unfortunately, it's proved not to be the case, because they had an absolutely priceless collection of single sheet items which went down in this destruction. So the book world of Renaissance Europe presents us with a strange paradox. By 1600, an almost unthinkable number of books had been published, and even ordinary citizens could amass a considerable collection. But 4 centuries of conflict since, and the normal depredations of time, have taken a heavy toll. The data collected in St Andrews suggests that something like 200 million copies had been printed by 1601. But for each edition, the average number of copies that survive is around 3.5. That is, far less than 1% of all the books printed in the first age of print have made it through to the present day. Furthermore, we need to bear in mind that some types of books were far more common than others. Some 15th and 16th century books are really quite common. The Nuremberg Chronicle, published in 1493, is a quite magnificent book, and it's exhibited in your present exhibition 1514. But it was also recognized at the time as such, which is why over 1,000 copies of the Latin and German editions survive today. We have 2 in St Andrews. More than half of the copies of the Gutenberg Bible published are still extant. This is the copy in the New York Public Library. But the tendency of great libraries to collect the same sorts of books means that whole categories of books have been lost altogether. The great libraries tend to replicate each other. On the other hand, more than half of the 345,000 books now known to have been published before 1601 survive in only 1 copy, and many have disappeared altogether. This is a little graph we did of survival rates of the early French books we surveyed, and you see that the graph climbs very steeply towards 1. And if you complete the graph through 0 by negative mapping, you see that the correlation for 0 is something like 128,000 editions. That is, 2 books have been lost for every one that survived, or 2 whole editions are unknown. So, if so many books are lost, how do we recapture this lost world of knowledge? Insofar as it can be done, it will be done through the employment of new technology. The books of the 16th century, particularly the little books, are dispersed around 6,000 libraries and archives worldwide. Archives are particularly important holders of books. No one can visit them all, but thanks to the internet, it is now possible to access remotely a large number of their catalogues. And when that is done, one can download, digest, compare the information, creating ultimately one master list that should comprise the complete corpus of known books. But we can go further than this. Many of these books have notes of ownership or provenance. By recording these and comparing them, we can begin to reconstruct some of the lost libraries of the Renaissance, wherever in the world these books may now be. Another source of information on lost books is the numerous manuscript book lists or inventories that survive from the 16th century. This is one of the account books of Christopher Plantin in Antwerp, and he notes here very carefully what books he sent where. It's a wonderful and as yet partly unexploited resource. These inventories were compiled for many reasons: when the stock of a bookseller was investigated for heretical texts, or when it was assessed for value after the owner's death, and this is the most common reason for the listing of a personal collection. Towards the end of this period, we also see the first printed catalogues of personal book collections, sometimes when a very large collection was to be sold at auction. When do we begin to incorporate this data into our records? This includes many thousands of records, many thousands of references to books whose present location is unknown, and we can begin to recreate the complete profile of a 16th century book. We can tell not only where these books are now to be found, but who were their 16th century owners and how much they paid for it. We can also, through this process, add to our database many thousands of books known to have existed, but where we've not yet located a surviving copy. And the Universal Short Title Catalogue, of which we've been speaking, actually has the location of over 5,000 lost books, or at least records of them. This is work, I think, that will take on knowledge of the 16th century book world far beyond what's been possible in conventional bibliographical projects. For many very good reasons, reasons of national politics and funding priorities, the study of early books has thus far been conducted essentially within national compartments. We have a German national bibliography, an Italian, an English, and so on. And in most cases, those national bibliographies have searched only the libraries of their own country. The German national bibliography is composed entirely of the books in German libraries. But this separation of the book world into national compartments does little justice to the realities of trade in 16th century Europe. It mattered not at all to a 16th century collector whether the text he desired was published in Venice, in Paris, or in Basel, so as long as they could get hold of it as a reasonable price. The international book market was organized to make this possible. For this reason, the market in Latin books was essentially one pan-European integrated market. And this diagram shows that something like 90% of Europe's book trade is published within this quadrilateral, including London and Paris, which are actually slightly outside. And you see that all these major places of printing are organized around Europe's great river systems and around the major communication networks to move books from one to another. I think this shows that a little better. I've divided here the European book market into center and periphery. And you can see that the central countries, essentially France, Italy, Germany, with Switzerland and Low Countries as markets helping move books around, they're responsible for something like 80% of the total output and something like 92% of the scholarly output. Now, our universal book catalogue has for the first time recreated the single integrated market of the 16th century book trade. It will also allow us to correct some of the limitations of the present national bibliographies. Most established national bibliographical projects incorporate information only from libraries within their own national domain. The German from German libraries, the Belgian from Belgian libraries. But books were meant to travel. In the 16th century, Low Countries books formed a major part of their export trade. It would be most surprising if the books printed in Belgium were still in Belgian libraries. When we conducted our survey of French language books, we found that 30% of the books we can find are extant only outside France. This is this present diagram. We would not expect that to be any the less with other books with an obvious international readership, and so it's proved. Our survey of books published in the Low Countries has added a further 8,000 works to those known from published national bibliographies. And we can do one other important thing. I've already said that up to a third of the books we know of from the first age of print survive in only one copy. But libraries do not, on the whole, know which books these are. They don't know which are their rarest books. They know which they regard as the most precious or the most valuable. But these, as we've seen, are seldom very rare. The Nuremberg Chronicle, 1,000 copies, Gutenberg's Bible, half the stock. Another very good example, very pertinent to Eastern Europe, is Copernicus. This is the most precious book that many libraries possess, and indeed it's the most stolen book of the 21st century. At least 9 copies have been stolen from libraries, mostly in Eastern Europe since 1989. But actually there are 277 copies of this surviving. It's over half the print run of this book survive. So libraries tend to value books which are famous, written by a famous author, highly illustrated, the sort of thing, indeed, that was valued by contemporary collectors, which is why they've survived so well. The sort of books that don't survive are books that were not particularly valued in their own time or were simply used to destruction. Broadsheets, almanacs, cheap books on religious instruction, and school books, or indeed news books. This is an early news book. I've been doing a study of this early serial, and I found, I think, 1,500 copies of this, and the vast majority survive in one copy only. Now, it's impossible for libraries to go through their entire stock of early books just to check how many copies are elsewhere, but we can. We can do this for them in St Andrews, simply by running a relatively straightforward test in our data. Once we've got the data of your library in our resources, it takes us about 5 minutes. Here's one example of a test of the early French books we did for the University of Pennsylvania. We see here that about 4.8% of their French books are known in only one copy. 2 in 4, 28 in 3, 40 in 4, and 670 in 5. But we can tell them not only which of those 39 books which they need to take special care of, but we can tell them also which of the others are known in only one copy on the American continent, for instance. Here's the similar result for Yale, and here Yale, bigger collection, 243 of their early French books are known in only one copy. That's 9.1% of their books. So this is what we're proposing to the world's libraries. We're going to ask libraries to sign up to our program, which we're calling Preserving the World's Rarest Books. We will then give them a list of apparently unique items in their collection. They will, in return, undertake to make these books a priority for digitization. We will then make these unique items available to the whole world through the USTC. We already have 100,000 full-text editions attached to the USTC in this way, all indicated by a camera item on our results page. So the Universal Short Title Catalogue, the USTC, will advance the knowledge of the world of early printed books in ways we scarcely envisaged when we embarked on this work. For us, there is a sort of added pleasure in using 21st century information revolution to unlock the secrets of the last great technological breakthrough from manuscript to print. But this comparison should also give us pause. Technological innovation is frequently accompanied by excitable rhetoric and totally false prophecy. So it was with printing in the 15th century. Scholars and investors created elaborate hymns of praise to the marvelous invention of printing. None were more enthralled than the humanist scholars who, until this point, had worked so hard to gather together their collection of manuscripts. The new art of printing would create a new world of scholarship where accurate texts were freely available in multiple copies. Print, they wrote, would itself be the Renaissance. It would turn darkness into light. In fact, the major areas of innovation through print turned out to be in areas where scholars had little interest: the development of a market for news, or the popular religious literature that encouraged wide public debate and incited religious discord. Humanist scholars did not want this at all. They wanted a larger, more convenient supply of texts for people like themselves. Indeed, if they'd known how the market for print would evolve, they would probably have heartily disapproved. Now we are told we should imminently expect the death of the book. Yet more books are published with every passing year. When I embarked on my doctorate, my PhD in 1979, my tutor cheerfully predicted that I would never write a book. I think, in the context of the conversation, that this was a judgment on the speed of technological change rather than on my qualities as a scholar. Well, I hope so. Whatever, he was wrong. 30 years later, 40 years later, the book remains an essential aspect of both scholarly life and public recreational culture. And whole forests are sacrificed every year to bring books to an eager public. The book survives because it is an object of technological genius, refined through 2 millennia since the Romans decided that there must be a better way of storing information than on scrolls. The invention of printing was a critical moment of evolution, but the shape of the physical artifact was already determined, and remarkably similar to the books we own today. The 16th century represented a critical era, not because this was a moment of technological change, but because following this technological change, the book became commonplace. This empowered whole new classes of reader. Men and women who could previously not have hoped to own a single book could now own many. But this process, the democratization of a previously luxury item, dealt a heavy blow to the Renaissance library. It would be several generations before the library would find a new role in a world where the book was suddenly commonplace. The work we're doing in St Andrews allows us an unrivaled opportunity to study this whole process, how print conquered Europe and sent out into the market new texts and new readers. It shows us how this flood of new materials first seemed fatally to undermine the social role and importance of the library, which had been the place where great men gathered to display their wealth, their books, and only incidentally their erudition. Only in the 17th century was the library recreated as a physical space with a new role as a centre of scholarship. And only in the 21st century is it being reimagined again as a place of conversation and conviviality and freeing itself, emancipating itself from the silence of 4 centuries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, maybe you can answer some questions. Are there some questions? Definitely we have many comments.
Thank you so much for your informative talk, and I actually have 2 questions. One is about American collections. You mentioned collections in Europe, in Eastern Europe, and in Northern Europe and Southern Europe, but when and how did the book and manuscript collection begin in the United States? Could you say a couple of words about this? And my second question, if I can, is about the auctions. You mentioned at some point the word auction and sales catalog, and I'm asking because a couple of years ago I had to trace a manuscript which is now dispersed between Bratislava, Paris, and Japan, and I had to trace it to auction catalog, and I had real troubles finding out information. So my question is, are there any attempts of incorporate auction catalogs into some kind of database and make them available? Thank you.
Right. Well, to answer your first question, the main period of growth of the American collections was in the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. And it's the result of two not linked but parallel phenomena. One was the development of huge fortunes on the part of the industrialists who had monopolies in steel, coal, and other technologies, the railways. The other was the impoverishment of the British aristocracy. So a great number of these collections were essentially created from country house sales. At the same time that Americans were sending over their daughters to marry into these families to try and keep them going, they were also taking back huge collections of books. And of course this has continued to this day, and the American libraries are still the most formidable competitors in any competition to buy early printed books, and still buy often in bulk. To answer your second question, there is a project at present for the digitization of auction catalogues, and this is being orchestrated by Brill in Leiden. They have already, through IDC, a large microform collection of auction catalogues, and they're trying to bring this into the digital age. What we would like to do is something rather different, and that is to go through these auction catalogues line by line and capture the information of the books described in them, and therefore try and rediscover some of the books which are no longer present. I should say also, by the way, that the Grolier Club in New York has a very fine collection of book auction catalogues. The other major source that's available to us is the catalogues of the Frankfurt Fair. When I did a very modest examination of the French vernacular books on sale at the Frankfurt Fair, I found that about 10% couldn't be traced in any known copy today. So that is potentially a very considerable addition to our knowledge.
Mr. Pettegree, thank you for your election. So I have two questions. The first one is regarding print runs. What amount of the print run was peculiar to Uncanobulus and the first printed books? And which of them was, beside the religious literature, most common in those times? And the second question is what fire and other damage precautions were in force in libraries of those times?
Well, the answer to your first question is, I think the working assumption of for incunabula is to assume a print run of between 300 and 500 as normative, and for 16th century between 700 and 1,000. That is what is suggested by particularly contracts in printing shops, where they specify how many pulls of the machine can be done. Well, of course, one of the characteristics of printing is that you cannot print the reverse of a sheet until the ink on the front side has dried sufficiently. So that imposes a certain rhythm. So there's no particular financial advantage in printing a smaller edition. So this is why we think in those terms. By far the largest editions were of indulgences, the printing of indulgence certificates. This was a fantastic piece of mechanization for those who were selling these things. And we know of one contract for 100,000 and one contract for 200,000. So that was divided among separate printers. So there were clearly enormous amounts of indulgences. I'm working at the moment on the Reformation, and one of the interesting things I've discovered is that exactly the same printers who printed Luther in 1518 and 1519 had printed the indulgence against which he was protesting in 1515. So, you know, printers have no real sense of ideology. It's a trade. As far as I know, there were no protections taken against fire, except that the finest libraries would be built in stone. And indeed, the protection taken against fire today is an extra significant peril for books, particularly 16th century books. I remember when we were first setting up an exhibition, we tried to borrow a couple of books from the National Library in Edinburgh. And they were very picky about this. No, these cases aren't big enough, these cases aren't good enough, these cases are this, that. Well, since we were holding our exhibition in an auction house, which specializes in the sale of early printed books, I thought it was a bit strange. So I wasn't particularly sad when a couple of years later they had an electrical fault, which almost resulted in drenching their entire collection of early printed books when the sprinklers would have been turned on. So precautions have their own dangers.
May I ask you, to those who are asking questions, please introduce yourselves, that we could trace you back afterwards, because this whole thing is recorded. So.
Igor Vatolin, a journalist, not expert on books and libraries. I have a more general question on, so you mentioned that in Renaissance time, libraries were quite a busy and noisy place, then they became silent as mausoleums, but now when electronic books appeared and modern libraries with cafes, conference halls and something else, so what change do you see in this change in the shape of the books, and do you call those electronic devices still books, or so what's your attitude towards technological shift in library world?
Right. Well, I have to say I probably do not represent the whole scholarly community here, because I've never found silence stimulating. Indeed, if I'm writing and I'm finding it difficult to find the way to express an idea, I often go to a coffee shop, and I find that the noise, the movement, actually stimulates the intellectual process. So I've never had a particular personal sympathy with the obsession on silence that you get in many libraries. And my experience, I think in the course of this work, I've worked in about 300 special collections, workrooms. And one thing I notice is that the staff never whisper. If they have something to say to each other, they say it at normal speaking pace. Well, that's sensible, because if you spend 40 years whispering, I think you do a lot of damage to your vocal cords. But in consequence, I follow the same practice, you know, and if I'm speaking to the staff, I also talk at normal volume. I think in the University of St Andrews now, 80% of our resource is spent on electronic content. Very few physical books are being bought, not least because the storage issues are such. Our library is full, and so even to receive a book, a physical book, as a gift carries with it a considerable obligation. But I think it's also just a reaction to an understanding that people have a far more mobile way of reading. It's also a communal activity. We're putting far more stress on our study method and on our examination method in St Andrews, on communal work. So to insist that the reading process is an isolated one doesn't really reflect the experience of the rest of society. My one anxiety about this is that there is the beginnings of research, and I saw a piece in Scientific American on this, that reading on a screen is intellectually about 10% less effective than reading text in physical form. That's partly because I think the whole transition to electronic reading has underestimated the extent to which reading is also a tactile process, and where you are also taking in information from the place on the page and not just the text itself. Obviously, for someone interested in 16th century books, as I am, being offered a electronic substitute for a book is absolutely hopeless, because I'm really interested in the artifact rather than the text it contains. So I think the process of adaptation is going to be quite a prolonged one when we work out what is the optimum mix of physical objects and electronic delivery. And we probably have to accept that both have advantages and disadvantages, and the mix will continue. Certainly the case in St Andrews that when we redesigned our library a year ago, we turned over a whole floor to social learning and collective learning. And I'm sure that will be the case elsewhere as well.
Thank you. I will use my position and say, mark out that Swedes pillaged not only Prussian libraries, but also University of Uppsala benefited from Jesuit library in Riga, so it was also brought in 1620s to Uppsala, and we were not the only ones from whom the books were stolen. They're not going to give them back to us, aren't they? But my question would be, you mentioned the crisis of the library in the 16th century. Could you please expand a bit more on the reasons why the crisis of the library started, and what was the reason for revival of library in the 17th century? So is it only amount of books, or it has something to do with the change of the society during the Reformation, or what are the possible reasons why library loses its role?
Well, I think the whole history of consumer society is concerned with the progressive redefinition of luxury. Each societies have their luxury items, which are exclusive to a very small number of privileged consumers, whether that be cars or clothing or books or zoos, which were of course the ultimate luxury in medieval Europe. Only the king could have a zoo. So when those luxuries are democratized, when luxury becomes available with the designer clothes revolution of the last 20 years, for instance, those at the higher levels of society have to find new ways to express their difference. They can buy a football club or a very expensive yacht or something of that nature. And I think books were simply victims of this process in the 15th century. In the 15th century, owning a book was a very intimate and personal business. You had first to find the text. You had then to persuade the owner of that text to hand it over to you to have it copied. You had then to find someone who could copy it. And in the process, you could change it. You could say, well, actually, I'm only interested in the first text in the volume you've lent to me. And instead of having the other texts you've got, I'll bring in 2 or 3 texts of my own. In this way, the book in the 15th century is a natural miscellany. It's a personal collection of texts. Now, in many respects, printing represents a backward step for book owners, a backward step for existing book owners. Not only are they giving up this highly personalized, illuminated, colored object, they're also giving up the right to decide the contents of their text, because the text will be predefined by the publisher. So for many reasons, the traditional owners of books found them less alluring as a way of expressing their specialness in society, and they had to look to other ways. And so that, obviously, since these were the people who created libraries, this is what created a crisis, which was then further exacerbated by the preference of scholars to have their own books rather than to use a collective collection, for instance, in a university.
I think we have a chance for one more question, last question. Is there someone who wants to ask a question?
you're the landscape historian. Could you say maybe a couple of words on what we could call today library management? So you said that people were acquiring books or Matis Corvinus commissioned an entire library. But do we know something about collecting strategies? Did people clarify, okay, I'll be collecting that, I want to collect that, and of these books, when I'm short of space, I'll get rid, and so on. So did people reflect on these topics, or just, bought books and books and that's it?
Well, I think there were some discerning collectors who would, certainly 2 or 3 collectors who went from England and Scotland to Florence, which was then the established centre of industrial manuscript production, or they could go to Paris, which was another very important centre, and they actually supervised personally the gathering together of a collection. But that was really impossible when you're talking of these bulk customers, because simply to make a single object, a single manuscript, might take a single scribe a year. So if you wanted anything like the vast collections that are being accumulated in the 15th century, that was a process which required agents. And one of the most effective ways of doing this was to employ someone who was themselves involved in the production process, who could recommend a discerning scholar like yourself should have. And of course, when they were dealing with dukes, kings, and noblemen, they weren't talking about people who were discerning scholars, but people who wanted to wear the clothes of scholarship without necessarily having the equipment to do so. I understand that there is, even today, a very estimable profession of book dressers who will accumulate a library to someone who's accumulated wealth suddenly and feels that they should have a library appropriate to dress their house with. I think that would be a wonderful profession to have, but I think that is exactly the same spirit we're seeing in the 15th century.
Okay, thank you, Professor Pettegree, for your lecture, and I also would like to thank you, audience, for coming. Thank you, and well, I think it's the best lecture on book history we have had in this library, not because it's a very new library, but also standard now for the lectures on book history is really high. Thank you.